welcome back to the French Connections HCB YouTube channel. On this episode of Real French Connections, we are going to be talking to the lovely Jill, whose story is a little bit different from the others. She actually decided to move to France several years ago, back in the late 80s, early 90s. So her story and how she found French Connections HCB is a little bit different than everybody else's. I hope you enjoy. Morning, Jill. Thanks very much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.
Pleasure.
So we're going to talk about your experience of France, in France, and a little bit about French Connections HCB, obviously, because that's how we get to speak to you, which is wonderful. Now, your story is a little bit different than a lot of the people that we speak to, because the majority of the people that we help are people actually moving to France who've either never been there before, who've holidayed there before and decided that's where they want to go, or who actually have maybe just been a couple of times and think, it's just the most idyllic life, I have to live there, that's kind of what I want to do. That's how they find French Connections HCB. Your story is a little bit different because it started an awful long time ago. Well, not an awful long time ago, but a considerable amount of time ago, compared to the life of French Connections HCB. So are you happy to share some of your story about your family's move, really, to France and where you ended up settling?
Absolutely, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I first went to France on a day trip to Calais, on a ferry, because I lived in Kent and we lived quite close to Dover. So France was somewhere close by. In fact, Calais was closer to our home than London. So my parents were always quite adventurous people, and so a day trip to Calais and sometimes to Boulogne were part of our childhood. So it wasn't a very strange place. I spent a long time, most time in France when I was 14, and I went on my French exchange. Now, I wasn't a very good student, so I didn't speak particularly good French from schoolgirl French, but I was lucky enough to have a very unfriendly French exchange pal who came to stay with us for 5 weeks and was a bit picky, but she was okay. But the moment I got back to France with her, I was in Angers, in Maine-et-Loire. She and her family refused to speak a word of English to me.
Right.
So I will be forever grateful to them because I learnt French. I learnt French like a baby, like a child. I didn't know the language, but I had to learn it because that's all that was being spoken to me. So despite that rather strange experience, I actually have always loved France. It has just been somewhere that I've always loved very much. So in 1989, my husband and I, property was on the rise, and my husband and I thought we had a little bit of spare money in our property. We lived in Kent still. So we thought we'd buy a place in France. So we bought a tumble down. Tumble down is very much the theme of our experience in France. We bought a sort of place in the country in the middle of nowhere in the foothills of the Pyrenees. Lovely. Near a beautiful medieval city called Mirepoix, which people I think will know. And we bought a house that needed doing up, and we got friends. Now, on that occasion, we did get a friend from England because he was quite happy to do the work for a holiday. Okay. He did most of the work in the house there. And we ended up with a lovely place with a garden. I mean, it was very rural and rustic. Yeah. But what we learnt from that was that the people in that area were very, very keen to help us, spoke with a strange French accent. So it wasn't the one I'd learnt in the middle of France.
Yeah.
And we learned lots of really useful words that I don't really know the equivalent in English. I
Okay.
mean, like fosse septique, and I do know that that's a septic tank.
Course, yeah.
Screws and bolts and nuts and rafters and ceiling and so we added to our French vocabulary that way by going and pointing at things in the sort of do-it-yourself place and in the building merchants and so that was a real education. So we learned.
Sure. It's the stuff that you can't get from textbooks, but that
Exactly.
are ultimately the most useful words you'll ever know if you
Yeah,
want to go and buy something, like you said, a little bit run
yes,
down, maybe.
that's right. Well, at that time, it wasn't at the beginning of the sort of British buying lots of rundown places, but it was still a pretty strong movement.
Yes.
Particularly the Dordogne was very much a lot of British people there. We had friends who lived there.
Mhm.
Now, in the meantime, my mother had worked with someone more or less my age who became a very close friend of hers, and she married a Frenchman.
Mhm.
So we were all sort of enmeshed in France. We sold our house at in the foothills of the Pyrenees eventually, but in the meantime, my mother and father had decided that they would move to France. They would retire to France. Now, my dad was over 70 and my mum was in her late 60s. So they weren't, starting over again. They were
Yeah.
definitely going. And they came over to France and stayed with their friends and had a look around. They wanted to buy somewhere that was within about a 6-hour drive of Calais because they were in Kent still. So they didn't want to be really close. They wanted to be in the real France,
Mm-hmm.
but they wanted to be able to get there in a day.
Mm-hmm.
So they went to a show in London, and I think it's usually at Earl's Court, and I don't know if they still hold it.
When
But
would this have been?
sorry,
When would this have been? What year?
this would have been 1990.
Okay.
And so they went and had a good look at the sort of property that was available and the prices. And they thought, yes, we'll do. So they made an appointment to meet someone out in France. And they did. And they spent a week in France. And they came home and they said to us, oh, yeah, we've bought somewhere. It's fabulous. You'll love it. It's wonderful. And we imagined they would, retiring there, they would have bought, the retirees bungalow or a
Yeah,
house
of course.
done up and all of
Yeah.
that lovely. And of course, what they had bought was what I now call Tumbledown Farm. They had bought the typical doer-upper. They had no experience in doing anything up at all. It was a farmhouse, stables, a barn, a cottage, land, and
But they just fell in love with it, and that's what they wanted.
they fell in love with it
Yeah.
and they decided that's what they would buy. Now, luckily, they had my mum's friend and her French husband to help them with all the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Now, people laugh about French bureaucracy. They say, oh, the French are so bureaucratic and there's so much paperwork and everything. I actually disagree.
Okay.
I think that there's exactly the same amount of bureaucracy in England or Britain as there is in France. It's just that in England, it's in English.
Yes. Yes.
So we know what we're doing.
And it's always been there, right? We've
That's
all
right.
grown up with it. Yeah.
Yes. And in France, it's in French.
Yes.
And it's technical and it's terms you certainly will never, ever in school.
Yeah.
Like I suppose it's similar to what we do in this country, is where we don't call somewhere a house or a home, we call it property.
Yes.
Those sort of differences. Anyway, my mother and father bought this place They had a French builder do work for them, and that was fine. It was livable, and they loved it.
Good.
So we then decided that we would retire to France as well. We were living in Nottingham at the time, so we'd moved away from Kent. So the journey down to the Pyrenees was a lot longer than it had been. Surprising the difference between Kent and Nottingham. I did a whole day because you can't jam it all into one 1 hour, one day. So we thought, okay, we'll have a look and be near mum and dad and my brother, who was living with them as well. So we found a really gorgeous townhouse in Loches, which is in the centre of France. It's in Sud-Touraine. It's an hour southwest of Tours, and it is a lovely little. It's got the medieval city bit. It's got a chateau. It's got a donjon, and it's just a very lovely little town.
Beautiful part of the country, yeah.
It is. Well, yeah, I mean, it's not the spectacular, beautiful.
The mountains and the lakes and
Exactly.
but it's different and it's got character.
It's French.
It's very French.
Yes. So we bought the house there, and again, we did what we always say we're not going to do, and bought something that needed work on it. But we struggled on, and we had a French builder, and unfortunately his work in the afternoon wasn't quite as good as his work in the morning. So there we were, quite happily, with a house near my mother and father and my brother, and enjoying the fact that we were European.
Yeah.
Because I feel very strongly about that, and I'm very upset that I am no longer, or at least I claim I am still European. And yes, there we are. We had our house, and we were well set up.
Lovely. So bringing it a bit closer then to where we are right now, that's obviously such a lovely, and I think lots of families, particularly in the UK, will have had that experience because it was so easy to go backwards and forwards across the channel, and it was very straightforward and everybody loved it. So this is kind of the reason why French Connections HCB was sort of born, I guess, was there was a lot of expats starting to move over to France, and Richard realised, especially down the southwest of France, that actually there was a little bit of a hole of people kind of just going and then realising they needed help once they were there. Now we're hoping that we're trying to let people know before you come, maybe reach out for a little bit of help. So you've obviously come and gone backwards and forwards, worked in the UK, lived in France, holidayed in France, I'm assuming, with the whole family. So what brought you to the point where you realised, actually, we need a little bit of help from French Connections HCB, and how did you find us?
Right. It was a sort of twisty road there.
Okay.
My father used to love France Magazine and various other publications, and they used to have the Connection newspaper every week. So they were very, keen to be part of not the expat community so much, but part of the community, but be able to know about it by reading about it in English, because their French wasn't that good.
Okay.
The first time I realised that I needed help was in 2016. My father had become quite frail, and because our house in Loches was convertible to a downstairs bed sitting room, and it had got a big kitchen dining room, we swapped houses with my mother and father. So Roger, my husband, and I were in the house in Musée, which is just outside Loches, and my parents and my brother moved into the house in Loches. Very sadly, my father died in 2016, in the July of that year. And I was lucky enough to have, say, to have researched death in France.
Yes.
But I had a little bit because my parents were both in their 90s.
Sure.
So it wasn't as macabre as
No.
So
forewarned is forearmed. That's what my granny would
right.
say.
Yes. And so I had found information in English about what to do in France if someone dies.
If the worst happens.
And that was when I sort of realised, that there was help available. And I have to say that the people in France were very helpful.
Yeah.
But there were also things where we had to cut corners a little bit because we didn't have some of the things that French families have automatically.
Okay.
And we managed, obviously,
Yes.
and we had a cremation and we had a little service and we had all our French friends there and I spoke in French and it was lovely. We did have a lovely ceremony and all our neighbours got together and made sandwiches and we had a wake. And if it hadn't been for our French friends and some of our neighbours, I mean, they weren't actually British, but we had a neighbour who was South African, who English speaking.
They're native English speakers, yeah.
Yes, and then lots of all our French friends. They supported us and helped us. But I remember at the time thinking, I don't know as much about how to make things work as I think I do.
Sure.
Because all the while everything's going smoothly, and we had managed, for example, when we bought the house, we had managed to set up a prélèvement, a direct debit. We'd opened a joint French bank account, so we had direct debits paying the water, the gas, the electricity, because when you first start something like in England, you get the form and it's fairly straightforward. It's just you and that property. So we kept everything. When my parents moved into our house and vice versa, we kept everything in the same names.
Okay.
But then, as I say, my father died. And yes, we managed the cremation and the ceremony and the service and registering the death. And then we knew that we'd had to, so my other brother had to register it in England as well, because so all of that happened fine. And then we came across a few problems because in France, and I think this is one of the things that has caused us the most problem, is that in France, a woman is known by her maiden name.
Yeah.
And when you set up things, they always ask you your maiden name and you don't think anything of it.
Yes.
But later down the line, you discover that you've actually registered with that, usually a utility or a public service in that name. So when we had to notify everyone that my father had died, so things couldn't be in his name, we thought it would be quite straightforward because they had a joint account. But it wasn't as simple as that because they tried to take the direct debit, but this time in my mother's name. And of course, they were using her maiden name. And there was no bank account in that name.
Of course.
So then started a 8-year saga with the local council, trying to explain to them that this wasn't her name, that this was the name. And eventually we sorted that out. We thought we'd sorted it out. And they simply agreed to change the accounts into her name with her maiden name and her married name. So she became double-barreled, and that was fine.
But at least it could be picked up.
Yes. Then came COVID. And of course, with COVID came Brexit.
Mhm. Mhm.
And this then turned everything upside down.
Mm.
We live in Brighton.
Okay.
My mother was in our house in France, and she was becoming very frail.
Mhm.
She was being cared for my brother, who also is very frail. So I think it was the day after lockdown in France and just before Britain UK lockdown.
Yeah.
We thought we've got to go over. We've
Mm.
got to look after them because they were panicking. What
Okay.
does this mean? What are we going to do?
Yeah.
So we there were no ferries.
Mm.
Uh, Ironically, we had a ferry booked to go over to see them. That
Anyway.
back to France. We were just in England for a bit,
Yeah.
and they that was cancelled. All the ferries were cancelled. All the flights were cancelled.
Mm.
So we drove to Folkestone and we drove to the shuttle.
Mm.
And I had written out in French all the reasons why I wanted to go to France.
Right.
We had gone onto the French government website and we downloaded all the attestation papers and we'd filled them all in because by then we had friends in France and we were talking to them, our next door neighbours, and they said, and they checked it all and read it all in French for us and told us what we needed to get in. Anyway, long story short, we got to Folkestone. We smiled a lot at the immigration man, which is not always a good idea. Because they think you're trying to pull one over them. And I gave him the piece of paper in France and he went, and he spoke to his colleague and he said, allez, allez, and he let us on the train. There were
Right.
only 2 cars on that train. And we saw at least 5 cars in Folkestone turned around and sent back.
Really?
They weren't letting everyone in.
Mm.
And I think that was the story of France in COVID. They made the rules and they stuck to them. So
Absolutely.
we drove through a deserted France and we arrived with my mother and a brother.
Mm.
We were in the house in the country, but we were going in to see them every single day.
Yeah.
We filled in all the correct papers. I mean, anyone who was living in France at that time will remember that in order to go out, you had to self-certify and you had to download an attestation and you had to fill in, and it included everything like where you were born and who you were, what time you were going out and what time you were going to go back, where you were going. And there were only a very few reasons as to why you could go out, and certainly why you could go further than 1 kilometre outside your house.
Sure.
And I think that was when I just thought, thank goodness for France, because the difference, and I mean, I don't want to get political, but I felt that the way that it was organised in England was a shambles. And I mean, that's not really political, that's what friends said and family said, and they were just, and so there was my husband and I and the dog, and my mum and my brother, and we were there. We obviously, when we first went over, made our mercy dash to Folkestone, we thought we were going to be there for 3 months permanently. But of course, it was 2 years. So, and in that time, we had Brexit.
Yeah.
And I won't go on about that because otherwise you won't ever stop me.
We'll do a whole different call on that, Jill.
Yes. Well, I have to say it made our lives very difficult.
Yeah.
Because we were very much part of the Union. We were very much part of the European Union, because we were using all the facilities that everybody in Europe was using. So we were just the same status as the French people and our neighbours. And then it became very complicated because we hadn't needed to be French residents.
No.
And then, during the sort of aftermath of COVID, where we were still all coping with that complete upheaval, and the whole lockdown thing confused my mother, who by then was in her 90s.
Right.
confused her terribly, and we tried not to tell her too much about it and keep it from her because she was becoming somewhat confused by then. But she would see snippets on the television, or she'd hear neighbours speaking or whatever. And at one time, she said, "Oh, the gendarme's going to come and get me because I'm English." And
Oh,
I said, "No, of course not." And she said, "Well, I'm English, and so I shouldn't be here because
oh,
of Brexit." And then she said, "And I might have COVID, so they might put me in prison."
oh.
And these are the sort of things that you deal with when
Mhm.
you have an elderly, frail, confused parent.
Sure.
Dealing with it in France, I was beginning to panic a bit.
Okay.
So then we had the most wonderful GP in France, who, with being my parents' GP for, I mean, I suppose nearly 30 years in the end,
Mhm.
he had learnt English sort of from
Oh,
them and learnt
that's
bits of English.
great. Yeah.
So we had to apply for French residency.
Mm.
And we had to get my mother and brother already had their green cards, their carte
The
vitale
can't
for
be
their
tell.
service. But
Hmm.
my husband and I had to get those in order to get health while when we were there.
Hmm.
Um, and we muddled through again, and we um, we got our French residency. We are French residents, and I feel quite happy with that. I'm not happy at the fact that I had to become one because I thought I was one.
Yeah.
Um, but it's lovely, and we come to England quite a lot,
Hmm.
but we're spending half and half time really. Well, we
Yeah.
were spending half and half. We've been over in England much more lately, but France is still open to us, and
And it's still home.
so I mean, we're sort of building up to this because everything started quite easily to start with.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then things gradually became more and more complicated
Trickier and trickier. Yeah.
as things happened. So things got gradually more and more complicated. And then in January 2022, my mum died. And my dad was 96 when he died. My mum was nearly 96.
Mhm.
And we always say to our French GP, and we say to the hospital in Loche, grâce à vous, because we just feel they had brilliant healthcare in France, and they enjoyed a lovely lifestyle out there. And who knows why people live to be an old age, but they did live to
They
that
did.
age. They
Yeah.
were very happy in France. So anyway, my mum died. We knew how to deal with her death because we'd done it with my father.
Yeah.
So we went to the same funeral directors,
Mhm.
and we had the same advice, and we more or less knew what we were doing. And again, neighbours and friends and the French authorities were very helpful, and we got through that.
Mm.
And then everything absolutely got totally confused,
Mm.
because it had become a little bit complicated when my mother had to change her name, and had to use her maiden name as well as her married name.
Sure.
And then we sold our house in Losh, where she and my brother had been living, and
Mhm.
we all moved into what I call Tumbledown Farm, which is where they had bought and lived. And by then we'd done it up a bit, but it's not smart. It is rustic.
Mhm.
And so we dealt with the sale of the house. So by then we had bought and sold in France. So we felt we knew everything,
Sure.
but we knew nothing because um, everything went all right with the sale of the house. But then we wanted to transfer everything that we'd left in my mother's name, in the house we'd moved into, to my name. Because me and my brothers now owned their house.
Right.
Now, you can see it might be a bit confusing even in the UK.
Yeah, for sure.
But in France, it just was totally confusing. I
Right.
had to close her bank account, and they said, yes, it was done, and then it wasn't done. And then they said, well, how do we know? We've got to give you the money. And I showed them the will, and I showed them the testament, as it was, and that they saw that, and they said, yes, all right, we'll do it. And it didn't happen because somebody else had to sign something. But the big problem was with utilities and tax. So taxe d'habitation, all the impôts, tax foncière. And I actually got to the point where I thought, I desperately need help. Please, please, somebody help me, because I was getting letters to my mother saying, we're so sorry for our condolences. My mother. And then I kept writing back saying that my mother's dead.
Yeah, that's
And
difficult.
it was just a tangled mass. And then we got a check made payable to my mother for a refund that wasn't actually due. And then they wrote to us very quickly and said, send that check back. Didn't mean to send it to you. And I said, well, I can't use it anyway. You sent it in the name of a dead woman.
Yes. Yeah.
So I had seen adverts in various different English speaking, and I'd been receiving French Connections emails.
Oh, okay.
So I'd signed up for that, and I used to get them. I think it was weekly or monthly,
Yep.
but certainly this extra service, because French Connections originally, to me, was a sort of property. I mean, it had useful tips and things,
Yes.
but you could get to see, and it seemed to start sort of in the Dordogne and spread over. And I was just always interested in, lovely parts of France. And I used to look at the houses that were for sale, and then maybe think, oh, we'd go over and not buy somewhere, but go and see that region.
Just have a look. Yeah.
Exactly. And I'd seen this advertisement for practical help in sorting out things like your car and your taxes and all of this. Now, I wasn't looking for simple help. It was a web of confusion. However, I wrote to, I think it was Richard was the one who answered to me and said, yes,
we can help with this.
For a price, you'd help me. And you did.
Yeah.
It was a huge relief to me to have someone to offload that onto, bearing in mind that I'd lost my mum.
Yes.
So there was that going on as well.
Very difficult time.
And I had, before I turned to French Connections, I had been to the prefecture and the town hall and almost pleaded with them to please understand what I was trying to do. But I did come across this sort of intransigence that, no, we need this, and this. And at one point they said, well, they needed a solicitor's letter to say that my mother had died. I said, but you've got the death certificate.
Yeah.
Why do you need? But that's just the way it's done.
Yeah, there's a box to tick, and you just got to step in line. Sometimes that's what we say.
I needed someone also for my own mental health. I needed someone to say, I'll take that away from you and we'll sort it. And so I turned to French Connections, and yes, they took it all from me, and although it was very complicated, and although they weren't able to solve absolutely everything,
Sure.
because I did have to be involved still,
Mhm.
obviously, but that the advice that I got and the actual dealings that French Connections did, Richard and the girl who helped me,
Juliet.
Juliet.
Mhm. Problem solver extraordinaire is our Juliet.
Oh, right. Well, so Richard and Juliet took it away from me, and they said to me, "Oh, you need to do this," but it was them telling me what I needed to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we more or less solved most of it, and it was a great weight off my mind.
Mm,
And I think it is all sorted now, and we have
right.
the house, our tumble down farm, which is tumbling more and more. Um, and we have our French residency, and we have French health insurance, and we are there. And it going to French Connections actually removed an awful lot of stress
Mm.
and clarified those little things that you think are the same, and they're just not.
Yeah.
So it was. I'm very, very glad that I found you and that I asked you to help.
That's good to
It
know.
was, it sorted out what was a real muddle.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really interesting about your particular situation, like I said at the beginning, because you'd actually been there for a decent chunk of time and had very much settled there,
Mm.
and still finding things that actually we need a bit of help, because in fairness, we've helped people, French people in France, just
Mm.
who are going, do you know what, I can't deal with this at the minute, or
Mm.
I just need a bit of extra help. And I think that's really good for people to hear, that it doesn't necessarily have to be at the beginning of your journey. It can be a lot further on. You know, we are actually here to help. And it sounds like what you appreciated most about the services was the accessibility. You can get hold of somebody.
Mm.
Like you said, yes, you are still going to need to provide information, but you're speaking to somebody who can give you a reason why you need to provide that, and then getting it all together as much as possible.
Mm.
Let the goalposts change for the team as well. You know, they can do it 1 week or 1 month, come to do a very similar job in, you know, a month's time, and it's maybe with a different prefecture, and it's slightly
Mm.
different. And that local knowledge, I think, is really helping people. And that seems to be what you really appreciated as well, even being very comfortable in the country. That
Mm.
sounds like it was a good thing for you to have found at that time.
If I were to do it again,
Mm.
if I were to move to France again, I mean, without the knowledge that I've got now, but if I was
Yes.
a French virgin and was moving to
Yeah.
France again, I would, if I could afford it, I would definitely get French Connections to help me settle in.
Yeah.
Because while you're doing that, I think you probably could explain
Mm.
what it is you're doing and what will need to be done in the future.
Mhm.
Whereas we did it
Yeah.
and we set everything up, and that was fine while it all went smoothly. But
Mhm.
when change comes, as it inevitably will,
Of course.
and especially if you're elderly and you're retiring to France, like my parents, you know, it's quite likely you might die in France. You know, where
Let's
better
be realistic
die?
about it.
Lovely.
Absolutely.
My father was very happy to have been living and died in France, but you know, these things do happen, and things like electricity tariffs change, and who to deal with where changes, and that's when you just feel the waters rising.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
at the point where I spoke and turned to French Connections, the waters were here, and I thought I was drowning.
Oh, bless you.
And it just was such a relief. And I mean, yes, people would, my friends and family and anyone who needs to know anything about France always turns to me.
Yeah, of course, of course.
I've got English people in France. I've got people in the UK who are thinking of it, and they also ask Jill.
Yeah.
And of course, I know. So
Yeah.
I'm the one that knows. But
Yeah.
on that occasion, I just had got out of my depth, and thank God there was somebody who knew more than me.
And it happens. It does
Yes.
happen, isn't it? But yeah, we're the team I know is delighted to be able to know that they can be relied on, and they really are there to help, which is excellent. Lovely. So let's talk a little bit about France then. So we've done your journey, and we've talked about how French Connections, how you found French Connections, and how the guys helped you. So going back to your knowledge of Jill and her knowledge of France, what did you love most, or what do you love most? Is she still very much part of the community, about your community in France, and where you are? What makes your heart sing?
This is a very silly answer, but it's so French.
It's the
French.
perfect answer.
Um, it is different.
Mm.
I just love the fact that everything, I think the COVID experience actually encapsulated the difference. I think things are clearer in France and they're more structured somehow. Like, for example, I love the fact that the market comes. The market comes on a Wednesday and a Saturday. No matter what the weather, no matter what the occasion, it's there on a Wednesday and a Saturday, and people go there and they do their shopping. Now, I mean, that's not amazing, but to me, it was just, oh, those are the days that I can go and get my vegetables, meat, fruit, fish, and just things like a leather purse, because there was just the things that you get at a French market. And I know it's corny, but I love our market. I just love our market. And I love, again, really corny, I love the fact that there's a restaurant or a cafe that you go to and you sit there on a Saturday morning or a Wednesday morning with the market going on around you, and you see the same people and you say, bonjour, ça va, to the same people. And eventually, I mean, yeah, over the years, some of them become friends because you see them regularly. And it's that regularity that I find. I know it's different in French cities. I mean, I adore Paris. Paris is, yes, my favorite city. You know, it really is the city of light, and I just love it. And I know that life in the central Paris is different to life in Loches, which is why I chose Loches to live and Paris to visit.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also, I like in France, I love the fact that, and I think this is so telling, in the middle of the summer, you will get a family business, maybe a cafe, maybe a shoe shop, maybe anything. It will shut shop for 2 weeks, the height of the tourist season.
Yeah, middle of August.
They'll go on holiday, because the most important thing is not the money that they're going to make or lose. It's taking the family on holiday. And I just love that priority. I love that value. And that is so different than you would not find a profitable business shutting up shop for 2 weeks in August because they're going to go on holiday. No, they'll go on holiday in November or December, or not even December, because that's Christmas, February, whatever.
Plan it around the quiet times, for sure.
And I love the fact that the shops still close on a Monday. And a Sunday, and
from 12 till 2.
Yes. And I love knowing when there is going to be a bakery open.
So talking about your boulangerie and your cafe and the restaurant, do you have a favorite? Now you've been there for a long time, so this might be difficult.
My favorite cafe, and I think it might have just recently changed hands, but we used to call it Chez Vero, because the person who owned it was Veronique. But it is what is it called? Because we used to have that nickname. Café de Porte de Piquois, which is in the medieval city. You go through the archway into the medieval city, and there's a cafe. But I have to say that most of the cafes in Loches are lovely.
They're pretty great, right?
Yes. So all of the cafes and restaurants in Loches are lovely. They're all very French. They all have tables outside, as you would expect. On market day, you have to shove up a bit and let people in because they're very busy and it doesn't matter, and you do it. And the other thing I love about France and places to eat in France is there's nowhere where I couldn't take my dog.
Oh, that's great.
We don't have him anymore, sadly, but he was a French dog. He was a French rescue dog, and he was always welcome everywhere. Now, we talk about the British as being the sort of doggy nation, but no way compared to the French.
That's so
You can have
interesting.
your dog sat up with you at the table in France in a French restaurant.
Oh, and no one will bat an eyelid.
So, yeah, and I mean, in terms of restaurant, we've. I'm trying to think of Hotel de France, I think it's called, in Loches. Is an old-fashioned, lovely place to eat. There have been so many good restaurants. It's not on the gourmet trail, but what I like about the places in Loches is that you could go, for example, on a market day, we would go to Port de Piquois Cafe and we would have lunch. And the lunch would be, it would be a stew, or it would be a sandwich, or it would be a croque monsieur, a croque madame. But it was always freshly made. It was made there.
Local ingredients, inevitably.
Yes. And I mean, that was typical of all of the places really in the city, in the town. It's only a tiny town. I mean, last time I looked, it had a population of 7,000. So, it's not big. And I think that's what makes it special. But you can find in France communities that are small towns. You won't find many villages, large villages, small towns without a boulangerie, and when I say
Post office, a school, a church.
Yes, and when I say boulangerie, I mean patisserie as well.
Patisserie, yeah.
And that's the other thing I love about France.
Oh, absolutely. I'm with you.
Yeah.
I am with you on that for sure. Now, you've already said that if you were to advise anybody who was going to be moving over to kind of to reach out and to get a bit of help, is there any other advice you give somebody who was on the verge, still thinks they want to go, might not know it brilliantly? Would you say that they need to look in a particular area, or they need to consider certain things before they make the move over to France?
I think the most important thing to remember before you go and when you go is get a bit of French. Even if it is absolutely bog standard schoolgirl French, if you speak to a French person and you try to speak French, the reaction will be absolutely lovely because they know you're trying and they will help.
Yeah.
If you go and speak to them in English, they're not going to understand. Even if they understand, they probably won't understand.
Sure.
So that's my main absolute important piece of advice is attempt to speak, because they are French and it is France and they speak French there. So, why not?
I'm incredibly proud of it.
Yes, and it's a beautiful language and you will learn words that you don't know the English for. I can speak in French and not be able to translate what I'm saying because
there isn't an alternative.
Yes. The other advice I would give is think about where you're going from and your traveling time, and research what travel methods there are and whether they're likely to stay there. For example, when we lived in Kent a long time ago, we had the ferries that went to Calais and a ferry that went to Boulogne. And then, of course, after we'd left Kent, we built the tunnel, which is fabulously convenient, especially if you've got a dog, because the dog just stays in the car. But since we've moved to Brighton, we have Newhaven to Dieppe, and then we have Portsmouth to Caen, and I think you can go Portsmouth Saint-Malo. You can go Portsmouth to Santander. So if you want to travel back up into France from Spain, if you're in the Pyrenees area and the sort of Biarritz area, but time it. I mean, you don't have to time it yourself. You can go on one of these, Google Maps. That's right, and they'll tell you what the average driving distance is, because if you're not used to driving in France, I find it very easy. I find it quite natural to drive on the right. I don't know why, I just do. But my husband has been known to drive out of did drive out of a junction, go onto the wrong side of the road, see a car coming, swerve off, and practically write off the van. So, and he's lived in France. I do all the driving, but do sort of be aware of the fact that when you arrive, you've got to then, you're not, oh, wow, we're in France, it's lovely. You've then got to drive from there to where you live, work out how far you're happy to drive. And I think that no matter where you choose as your landing stage, whether it be any of the ports, I mean, I think you can go to La Rochelle and Bordeaux. There are lots of different places where you can arrive. You do then have to factor in how far you want to go. And I think you'd be hard pushed not to find somewhere lovely within your chosen driving time.
I completely agree. The amount of people that we speak to as they go along the journey, when they just literally starting, I think I want to live in France. And then you go, well, you need to drive around a little bit. And then you speak to them and they go, we just went from town to town and village to village, and every single one we could see ourselves living there. And I think that's testament to how great the place is there is so much to offer there, like you said, and you will, well, this is home. This could be home. We could make this work. And then you drive 10 minutes down the road. Oh, this could work. And I think you're absolutely right. You will find somewhere that steals your heart. You really will.
And just, you are spoilt for choice, as you say. And you arrive much happier if you haven't overstretched yourself. I mean, when we first bought in the down near Mirepoix, in a little village, well, it wasn't a village, it was a hamlet called Coutances, and that shows you the difference in the pronunciation, because I thought it was called Couton. until a local spent, and of course it's far more the sort of Spanish pronunciation.
Of course.
That was 13 hours from Calais.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we were younger, we were much younger, and I love driving. And if you share the driving, that was possible in a day. I mean, or we might just pick somewhere and stay overnight. But as I say, when we then moved from Kent to Nottingham, that became too far. So if we were using it as a holiday home, which we were at the time, that was too far away.
Right.
We didn't have, there were no cheap flights then to Montpellier or wherever. But that was a factor in why we sold that house and why we moved further up to where my parents were. Yeah. We probably wouldn't have chosen where we are. My parents chose it. And we did say at the time, oh, why have they chosen there? You know, because we thought, oh, you know, we moved to the Auvergne and the beautiful lakes and all the mountains or whatever. But we've just grown to love it. It's just home.
Yeah, that's lovely. That's lovely. Super. Thank you, Jill. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to hear more from French Connections HCB, like I said before, you can like and subscribe to the channel, which would be great, or get in touch at frenchconnectionshcb.com.